Everybody there, Caroline, Ariella, Giulio, Miriam, Helene, Elizabeth, everybody. Good to see you all. Happy to see you all. I'm still in New York. It's my Santa Fe background, so you can't tell. There's Lars. There's Tara. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Good evening.
Let's start again. Here we are, one more week to go. Another week gone, just like as if it's a second has gone, an entire 7 days has gone. So here we are again to continue discussing Samsara and Nirvana, using this excellent teachings by Venerable Fedor, who studied in this text. He said he was studying for 10 years. That's years ago. I think he did 25 years at Sarah J. He's thoroughly qualified. I think he's done the Geshe studies. Whether he got his degree, I'm not sure. He's very educated, far more educated than me. So I'm just giving a little bit of flimsy commentary from. And then you have to read him to get the proper story. Okay, he's given great details. His excellent teachings. Happy to be discussing. So, okay, we offer this mandala as always as an offering, thinking we're offering the entire universe, all the contents of the universe. Think of the ordinary universe. Don't think of it as cosmic. Whatever's in the universe, it makes people happy. You pile it all up in your mind, thinking big, and imagine offering to the Buddha as a request for the teachings.
Sashi perki chukching meto tramri rabri nihedekyan pari sangye jingdu miekte ubai roku nanda shingao jepaksho.
Say the next in English. Say it in English. It's nice to hear it in English sometimes, Lars.
Perfect, pure holy girls from the billowing clouds of wisdom and compassion in the sky of the Dharmakaya, please let fall a rain of profound and extensive Dharma upon the receptacle of those to be subdued exactly as they need. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakami Atayami.
Okay. So now I'll just say it in English. This next little prayer is our motivation. Two things: we're reminding ourselves of our reliance on the Buddha and his teachings. And then secondly, reminding ourselves of this amazing, altruistic, long, far-reaching goal. As His Holiness says, always aspire to do what is most beneficial. And if we can, long-term, better than short-term. So the real long-term is one's own Buddhahood. Of course, it's so cosmic for us thinking of future lives, but that's the long-term goal. So we're thinking we're going to listen to these teachings so that we can continue to sow the seeds in our mind that will manifest eventually as our own Buddhahood. Why? So that then we are fully qualified to be a benefit to suffering sentient beings. You can't get any motivation bigger than that. So that's the first recitation. We'll sing a couple of times in Tibetan. Sangye charang soke chognam la janchu badu dagni kyab suchi. Dagi Chunyen Gipe Sonam Ki Drola Penche Sange Drupa Shog Sange Charan Soke Chongnam La Jangcho Badu Dagni Kyab Suchi Dagi Chunyen Gipe Sonam Ki Drola Penche Sange Drupa Shog. Okay, so here we are, taking our Lam Rim as our basis for understanding where these teachings fit. Then this is the second scope of, this is in the second scope, or it's the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the middle capability, or as Venerable Fedor points out very clearly in the teachings, is the teaching shared by, put it that way, is the teachings and practices shared by a person who is in this middle scope of practice, which means, shared by means if we were in Thailand, for example, we'd only be doing the wisdom wing. The Mahayana path is not there. Buddhahood is not asserted. They accept Buddhahood, but it's not asserted and not taught in those teachings. So if you're on the path of junior school and high school, the first and second scope, the wisdom wing, you'd be finished. This is the teachings of the second scope, and it's how to get out of samsara and into nirvana. So the teachings in the Lam Rim. So if we were in Thailand, then what we would complete this sections of the teaching with would be the understanding of, and finally the realization of, both shamatha, single point of concentration, and emptiness or special insight. And then if we did all that here, we would have completed the Theravadan path. We would have achieved our own liberation from suffering and would have got out of samsara. But because we're on the Mahayana path, Then we have got the compassion wing to go, the Mahayana component, the Bodhisattva component, and there it is there at the end stages of the Bodhisattva path. That's where we think about and study and contemplate shamatha, single-pointed concentration, and special insight into emptiness. So that's not tackled here. So what's tackled here is what's expressed in the Four Noble Truths. And from the point of view of the Four Noble Truths, effectively, the main cause of our suffering in this universe is attachment. So that our job here is to get the renunciation of attachment and all the other delusions that come from it. And that would be pretty profound already, a pretty amazing realization. As Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, we would have renunciation if just the thought of attachment, if it would be so disgusting for us that we, it's like being in a septic tank. I mean, it's always very graphic, Rinpoche, because it's hard to conceptualize what these words mean for us because we're not Buddhists. We don't comprehend Buddha's view, and we have no conception of what attachment is. So if even just a moment of the thought of attachment is so disgusting, it's like being in a septic tank, then we can happily say we would have accomplished renunciation. So way to go, people, a way to go. Okay, so but we need to be very humble about it. So then we need to understand it. So what we're doing here is Venerable Federal goes into different things. He goes into more details about what suffering is. When I talk about the Four Noble Truths, I tend just to talk about the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering, the 3 levels of suffering. There's another approach to it that's called the 8 sufferings. And I never go into this. I never talk about this. It's just interesting. I really prefer the other, but let's go through this because he's discussing this in chapter 3. So the Four Noble Truths, remember, are the present Buddha's first teaching, and he's presenting these 4 truths for the noble ones, are the 4 facts about suffering. There is suffering. There are causes, there is the possibility to be free of suffering and its causes, and then there is the methodology to accomplish it. So, of course, if, this is the difficult part, when we hear about vaguely, attachment is the cause of suffering, blah, 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 we have absolutely no idea what it means because we are so addicted to attachment. It completely pervades our lives. The whole universe is expressed in terms of being objects of attachment, and we can't even conceptualize what it is. I mean, not to mention see it as suffering because it's so completely pervasive in us. So, and even if we hear about the suffering of suffering, when the bad things happen, we know that suffering, but still we just kind of consider it as just part of the deal. It's just the way life is, what to do, it's just the way life is. So we're very complacent about it, So of course, then if we want to understand what Buddha's talking about, what suffering is, even at the grossest level, we have to know what he means by suffering. And this is why for me, there's 8 levels of suffering are kind of quite abstract because we'd go, as soon as we hear these, you're going to listen to it, we'll go, but that's normal life. What are you talking about? So it assumes an alternative. And that's too abstract for our mind. So I'll just mention the 8. It's the beginning of chapter 3. Because if you want to be free of suffering, you have to know what suffering is. But crucially, you have to be sick of it. You have to want to get rid of it. But if you just think it's normal life, and life, you can't imagine life without it, then there's no framework for understanding why to give it up. So the framework of wanting to give up these 8 kinds of suffering, which is really abstract for our mind, is obviously reincarnation and rebirth. If we just assume one lifetime, one life, you're born, your mother and father make you, or God makes you. So if you believe in God, you can think of a second life, which will be heaven or hell, whatever. But if you're a materialist, there's no other choice. There is only this life. So these are understanding these 8 kinds of suffering within the framework of being a materialist, which is that when you die, you turn into dust. These are completely meaningless. They're completely meaningless because it's assuming you can get rid of them. So listen to them. They are the sufferings of birth. Well, we can know that. I mean, I wouldn't like to be God, no, I'm not trying to be controversial here, but I can't imagine why every mother doesn't get a cesarean. I think it's like absolute torture to get born. First, you're in this smelly, forget about being in the womb for 9 months. We romanticize it, but this is me. I'm a non-mother, so mothers might get upset. But if you think about it objectively, When you come into this life, you got to be, I mean, one friend of mine just telling me about how his first son was born. He was there. It was so horrific. He almost fainted. He couldn't even believe the suffering of this poor little boy. He had to be first suctioned out. They kept sucking his poor little head, and that didn't work. They said they used forceps and pull him by the head. Can you imagine the torture of this little person in there? If you did that to a baby once it's born, you would be sent to prison. Think of what I'm saying, please. So all I'm trying to get at here is the suffering of birth. It's so bloody evident, but we romanticize it with respect. And this poor child, the father said that when the child finally came out screaming his lungs out, his head was completely like a point. It was pointed because his poor little fragile little skull had been crushed by these forceps and by this suction, like what you'd suck shit out of a toilet with. Excuse me. This is my presentation of the suffering of birth, all right? Buddha says it more politely. But we romanticize it and we get upset. Mothers get upset if they hear me say that. So her next two children, she had a cesarean. And the father said it was just joyful to see it. And it was just a little baby cut and she didn't take too long to heal. So the little baby was sitting there and they plucked the little baby out and lift him up. No trauma, no freaking out, no destruction of his poor little body. I mean, newborn babies should be given chiropractics on day one to sort out their poor little squashed body. So I agree with Buddha, suffering of birth is horrific. And I came out my bum first. Can you imagine my poor mother? I can't imagine it. Luckily, came out after 7 months. I must have been impatient. Guess what? So God knows how Buddha puts it. But Jundrup's putting, what's his name? This monk, he's saying it very politely about how Buddha thinks suffering of birth is horrible, So here's 5 points why birth is suffering. The birth process itself is suffering. I just pointed it out. The place of birth, which is the aggregates, is suffering. That gets too abstract for us. Our birth is a source of a generation of suffering. That's abstract for us. Birth is a source for the afflictions to arise. That's abstract for us. And separation is the nature of birth. That's abstract. It's very abstract, all these concepts, because they all assume already, in my opinion, a deeper understanding. This is why, for me, speaking about the 3 levels of suffering, the suffering of suffering when the bad things happen, and then the suffering of change, which is more subtle. I think that's kind of almost comprehensible more than this, but never mind, they're the 8. So first of all, birth process is said to be suffering. Here one looks at the various aspects of being crammed up for a long time in a small space, but I don't want to go into these too much. The Sami doesn't want to go into it, most boys don't, They don't, he probably doesn't know what to say because he never had a baby, he's a monk, you see. So anyway, the suffering of birth. But immediately you see, really get the point here. It's not explicit. This is the point. These 8 points only make sense when you understand that Buddha is suggesting that you can be free of all these sufferings, which means you eventually, by realizing emptiness, you don't get reborn. Now, that to us is so abstract. Who wants to not get reborn? It's kind of weird for us. So we've got to understand the framework of these teachings, Because, of course, back in the time of India and the Tibetans, they all assume rebirth. They assume reincarnation. This is brand new for us. So to hear that something is suffering, and then you think, well, what's the alternative? You mean I shouldn't get born? What's that got to do with me? It's too confusing for us. So I'm not criticizing Buddha's teachings. I'm just saying these concepts are abstract. So let's understand these 8 sufferings in the framework of Buddha's discovery of a method to stop being reborn in samsara altogether. Then it will make sense. But this is so abstract for us, isn't it? To think of, I'd rather have nirvana. I'd rather be free of suffering. I don't want to get reborn again. I mean, some people say, I don't want to get reborn again, But if you don't have an alternative to it, he's not suggesting the alternative is just to turn into dust. What he's suggesting is you can be free of samsara altogether, and that's finally achieved by realizing emptiness. Then you can just be, then you can be just in a state of bliss. And that just sounds like, again, weird, too abstract for us. So never mind. I'm just giving my take on these 8 kinds of suffering. But if you think of the birth one, this is all Buddha wants us to think about. Of course, I just did it. I gave a reason why birth is suffering. Aging. Nobody can argue with that. So it's not as if Buddha is now got an alternative for some special medicine that'll keep you young for eternity. No, he's not saying that either. But if we look at the reality, this is very clear. the suffering of getting old and being old is undeniable. The very fact that we live in denial of it when we're younger already shows it's horrible. I mean, when you're young, I remember it. When you see, listen to this, when you see old people, it's almost as if it's a particular group of people and they're born like it. You can't see that, I mean, if you see the pictures of your grandma, you kind of, people see pictures of me when I was younger. They all say, oh, you were so beautiful. Oh, of course, you're beautiful now, they say politely, because they don't want to upset me, because I've got my wrinkles now. But they all say, oh, you were so beautiful, they say. And indeed, some people, the horror of getting old with wrinkles and double chins is very shocking. And so spend their lives trying to stay young or trying to change their bodies. We know that. So that really shows the horror of even the thought of getting old, And then when we are old, and we can see it, I mean, this is really evident in the world. It's just true. The suffering of being old, one of the clear sufferings of being old is you don't get seen. I mean, this is an interesting point about females. I mean, maybe men don't think like this, I don't know. But I know when you're a girl, you get looked at. You're really seen. You're seen in terms of the two things on your chest and all the rest of it. This is, I mean, we all do this. We objectify each other, whether you're black, whether you're female, we all objectify. I joke and say we've now finally discovered there's a group of people called white men, because they were always the default before, isn't it? There was always a separate, everything but a white male. Now we've got a new group called a white male. We finally recognized the default mode was white male. So that's another group. But in general, when you're born female, because the karma of being a female very strongly, we all know that, is one way we strongly objectify each other. We define women in terms of, generally speaking, when we change our minds, it's different. But the usual one is the suffering of being a female is you're defined in terms of your gender. You're defined in terms of your objectification by men who like girls' bodies, right? I remember vividly when I was in London, when I was a radical feminist, and my policy was to always, in any men whistled at me or praised my body or shouted, do what men do, you get arrested these days, I think, if you did it. But back in the 60s and 70s, you didn't get arrested. It was normal behavior. I remember one fellow, and my policy was to always confront the man, shout at him or punch him perhaps. I did it very seriously. I was a very sincere, radical feminist. I put my money where my mouth was. So I remember, and it was always very shocking for the poor men. They got a big shock. Of course they did. They usually just didn't say anything, but except one fellow, there's another story. I always tell this story. Maybe you heard me say it. One fellow in Haringey in North London, he was across the other side of the road and he was eating his fish and chips and he said something about me as I crossed the road, about my breasts or something, So I went up and I punched him in the nose and his fish and chips went flying. But he was unusual. He responded. No man has ever come and started to punch me. So he started chasing me down the street. I remember all these Greek cafes with the men drinking their ouzos and their coffees. They were looking on, thinking I was probably his girlfriend or something, and he punched me back. He punched me in the face. Well, I wasn't upset at all. I respected him because he responded. Most of the men just looked shocked and embarrassed, But this particular fellow in Soho in London, this old fellow, when he said to me about my breasts or whatever, and I insulted him, and he was almost in tears. And he said, this is not a feminist point. It is in the framework of the female one, but it's more about attachment, really about attachment. He is nearly in tears and he said, so genuinely hurt, if you don't want me to say something, why do you look like that? So that is typical female. That's the suffering of being female. But when you've got that kind of mind, in his case, attachment to female forms, when you see an object of attachment, look at cake. You just want to grasp at it greedily and put it in the mouth, don't you? If you're really attached to anything, you grasp at it and want it. Well, of course, if a male has got female shapes in his mind and he sees a pretty shape, he thinks it's his right to say something. And of course, then he got upset. If you don't want me to say anything, why do you look like that? That's how attachment works. So it is an interesting example of how we suffer. This is not in the list of 8 here. But I'm coming to aging. So what was astonishing as I got older, suddenly you get free of that suffering because you're no longer seen in terms of your beauty. Your breasts sag, you got wrinkles, you got double chins. I mean, and no man wants to look at a saggy old double-chinned lady, that's for sure. So you at least stop that suffering of being objectified for your body. But you get now seen as old. And the downside of that is nobody pays any attention to you, good or bad. I mean, we know this is true. We know it is true. And that's just how you're seen by others, not to mention the aches and the pains and the arthritis and the, all the suffering and the sicknesses. There's no doubt about that. But you see, because we so take for granted birth, youth, old age, in just the framework of being a human, which is the only possibility, we don't see any alternative. Even if you're a Christian, not even, I'm sorry, if you're a Christian, for example, you look forward to going to heaven. There's no alternative. You've got to suffer through the human life, and then you go to heaven and you've achieved liberation in heaven. But for the Buddhist one, it's what's implicit here is Buddha's solution, how to be free of these sufferings and how to get out of them altogether and be in bliss of nirvana. So it's a very different framework, So the next suffering is clear sickness. I mean, whether you're a baby or 90, you're going to have sickness. This is clear. You get sickness. Death is completely clear. How that's a painful, horrific experience for most people. Horrific. Not to mention just mentally, physically, but also mentally, because it's so horrific. You finally have to realize the reality of impermanence, which we've not been able to bear to look at. So the next four in this list are encountering the unpleasant, being separated from the pleasant, not achieving one's desires, even though one works for them, and then finally taking rebirth with contaminated aggregates. I mean, this all seems so abstract for us. That's why we have to study it all. But this is very clear. This is the suffering of having attachment, being separated from the pleasant. I mean, this is, and then not achieving one's desires. So being separated from the pleasant, I mean, it's just so obvious we have that suffering because we don't assume there's an option. We live in the horror of it. You've got a beautiful cake and then you keep eating it, it becomes repulsive. So you're separated from the pleasant. You lose things, you get poor, your husband dies, your children dies, your friends leave you, beautiful things end. It is so evident, it's outrageously evident. But because we assume all this is normal, we never question these things, So that's what Buddha's getting us to do. And the reference point, I have to repeatedly say it, the reference point for this questioning is Buddha's solution to having just being free of these sufferings is to get out of samsara, realize emptiness and get the hell out of samsara. And of course it's abstract for us. Of course it's abstract. So you've got to be, but it's so hard to see things as suffering. Again, repeat, we assume birth, aging, sickness, and death are normal parts of a normal life. 1. 2, and anyway, I didn't ask to get born, did I? So what are you telling me this for, Buddha? You're trying to rub my nose in the misery. I know it's suffering, but I didn't ask to get born. Why don't you blame God? Why don't you blame my parents? You get my point, people. We don't, but what is saying, all this is implicit, you see. And so we've got to really think about all this. Encountering the unpleasant. I mean, this is outrageous, meaning meeting things that are horrible. Ugly smells, ugly tastes, ugly people. It's when the bad things happen, which is really the suffering of suffering. That's the suffering of suffering. Then being separated from the pleasant is, just as painful. You have delicious things, you have beauty, you have youth, you have pleasures, you have money, you have beautiful lovers, you have children, but look at it all. It all goes like a dream. This is not meant to be depressing. Buddha's trying to get us to see it for what it is, but all the time the reference point is knowing there's an alternative. Because what's the point of rubbing your nose in it if you can't change it? That's the clear point. And then not achieving one's desires, even though you work for them. This is really common. I mean, even you could get your desires fulfilled when you work for them, but look at the suffering of millions of people. Even just thinking about money and things, cash flow. Many people work 80 hours and still never get anything. Still miserable, poor, struggling, exhausted. This is a common suffering of millions of humans on this planet. Probably more than those who do get their desires fulfilled. And that's only temporary anyway. So I mean, they're all sort of evident, they're obvious, but to see them freshly. And this really takes time, because you just think, yeah, all right, okay, suffering of birth, aging, sickness, yeah. But you've got to have enthusiasm to do this. So you get enthusiasm to want to give them up, which is enthusiasm for nirvana. And this is so subtle for us, so abstract, so in the sky, you know. So it's hard work to think of all this. It's hard work, you know. And then the final one is taking rebirth with contaminated aggregates. I mean, that's just so abstract, we can't believe it. Let's see what Venerable Fedor says about that, the 8th one. 4th, 5th. Second, suffering, aging. There's a whole bunch there. 3rd, 4th. You should read them all. They're very helpful. Nature of the body changes. All this goes on and on about the body being suffering. It's so clear. So read Fedor's teachings, please. They're very helpful. 4th suffering is death. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I mean, you know, becoming separated from one's beautiful, perfect possessions, becoming separated from one's nice relatives, becoming separated from one's circle of friends, becoming separated from one's good, perfect, beautiful body, experiencing heavy sufferings, both physical and mental. I mean, this is so clear. But to hear that Buddha's got an alternative to dying, that's pretty abstract. We've got to keep thinking about it. Then the 8th one, 5th suffering, encountering the unpleasant, that's all clear. 6th suffering, separation from the pleasant, that's pretty clear. 7th, okay, 8th suffering, taking rebirth with contaminated aggregates, inducing the suffering of future lives, becoming the basis for the suffering of sickness, aging, and so forth, becoming the vessel for the suffering of suffering, becoming the vessel for the suffering of change, and being born in the nature of pervasive compounded suffering. They're the 3 kinds of suffering. They're the 3 kinds of suffering, which is the alternative packaging of suffering, you know. So contaminated aggregates means, so aggregates is this way that Buddha presents how we're made up of 5 components. You know, it's just a way of presenting we're made up of 5 components. And they describe this all the time in the Buddha's teaching. So we need to become familiar with it, you know. And it gets referred to in lots of different places in the teachings. For example, when you hear about the 5 Buddha families, you might hear about how each of them is a purified aspect of the 5 aggregates. When you hear about these 5 aggregates, when you go through the death process, well, each one of these at each stage is what, you know, the first 5 start to disintegrate. So we have to understand this Buddha's teachings, what he means by these 5 aggregates. It's all part of the learning, having the deeper knowledge about Buddha's way of seeing things, you know. Now, there's another set of sufferings, which is called the 6 sufferings. There's the 8 sufferings, the 6 sufferings, and the 3 sufferings. I mean, if you don't think there's an alternative to these kinds of sufferings, if you assume they're just the way life is, then you don't bother looking at it. You don't bother reading Buddha's teachings. You've got to keep remembering the reference point, the framework in which these teachings are presented, stating the obvious, all these types of sufferings, is that Buddha has a method to get free of them. And the only time you want to get free of something is when you know very well how horrible it is. So, you know yourself, if you're really addicted to cigarettes and you're so addicted you can't bear to think about the suffering, the only thing that'll energize you to give it up is when you think in detail and look at videos and look at people's experiences and learn about lung cancer. It's only when you see the suffering caused by smoking that you will then want to give it up. But if there is no alternative, if there is no solution, then why would you look at the suffering of smoking? This is a really important point. But the way all the teachings are presented is sort of, there's implicit things here, but we have to sort of get the implicit points. Here I'm making them explicit, you know. So what are these suffering, contemplating the 6 sufferings? The first one is the suffering of indefiniteness. The second is the suffering of dissatisfaction. The third is the suffering of abandoning one's body again and again. And the next is taking rebirth again and again. And then the next one is moving constantly between high and low, and then being friendless. It's really just pointing out, again, from the Buddha's bigger framework of the entirety of samsara, just these sufferings. So let's just look at them briefly, you know. Indefiniteness means that everything's impermanent. You can't guarantee anything. We know this, even though we work so hard on making things definite. We know it's not possible. There's no definiteness to cyclic existence, both from the point of view of one life or many. Whether you look at it from the point of view of just this life, or from the point of view of all our past lives and all our future lives, there is really no definiteness in cyclic existence. Just from the point of view of this life, this is Venerable Fedor, the only thing that is definite is that you're going to die. So probably this is the one that we really can begin to think about, you know. But not just that. We try so hard to get happiness, get happy feelings. We work unbelievably hard. It's what governs every choice we make, this wish to get happy. And then we think of it in long term, but accumulating enough money for a pension plan, accumulating enough for a future, accumulating our children, accumulating our property, accumulating our partners, all built on the assumption that somehow they're permanent, because we can't bear to think about impermanence. We can't bear to think, even though the evidence is staring at us, that nothing is certain. And then when we do think, well, if nothing is certain, then we'll sort of chuck out the baby with the bathwater, and we'll go, then why bother? What's the point? If it's all uncertain, why bother? So it's really hard for us to we're either grasping at everything as permanent, or we become completely nihilistic. You know, we can't get anywhere in between. So all this stuff's really exhausting, right? Buddha's sort of rubbing our nose in all these things that we know are true, but usually we assume that there's no alternative for, you know. And this is where all the time you got to read these in terms of Buddha's alternative, which is to give it all up by finally realizing emptiness, getting out of samsara. But here the main one is giving up attachment. This is utterly profound when we can, you know. It's good to read the details. I want you to study Fedor's teaching. That's a real certain point, okay? Oh, there's this wonderful story. Sorry, Lama Zopa tells this story as well. So he tells it here. From the point of view of many lives, there's no definiteness in cyclic existence. Our parents of this life become our enemies in the next life. Our enemies of this life become our friends in the next life. There is a story where Shariputra passed by a house. Shariputra is one of the Buddha's main disciples. In that house, the father of the person living in the house used to eat fish from the pool behind the house. Then the father died and was reborn as a fish in that pool. The mother, where are we? The house owner, so then the mother was very attached to the house. When she took rebirth as the house's owner's dog. The father became a fish in the pond and the mother became the dog. Then the house owner's enemy, who had been killed for raping the house owner's wife, was reborn as the house owner's son. So the house owner had an enemy who had raped his wife and who then got killed for that rape. And because of being attached to the house owner's wife, he took rebirth as the house owner's son, as the son of the woman he had raped in the previous life. So then what happened? The son went to the pool and fished and caught the fish that had been the house owner's father in the previous life, and he killed it. Then while he ate the meat of the fish that was his daddy, the dog, which was his mother, ate the fish bones and was beaten by the son. And the little son, who was actually his enemy, was sitting on his knee. So when he saw this, and because he's clairvoyant, you know, Shariputra said, he eats his father's flesh and he beats his mother. He carries the enemy he killed on his lap. The wife clings to her husband's bones. Samsara is hilarious. I mean, if reincarnation is true, as Buddha has assessed, then he's right. It is hilarious. But because we're so caught up in seeing everything is inherent and permanent, we have tunnel vision and grasping at this one person and one real enemies and real friends, it's like a joke. Even this alone is enough if we have confidence in reincarnation to kind of loosen the grip of these labels a little bit less, you know. See, as he says, nothing is definite in samsara. So the second suffering, he's calling it no satisfaction. This is really just attachment. So then we have the second. We won't experience satisfaction. The second suffering is a suffering of dissatisfaction, of not knowing satisfaction. There's no contentment to be found in experienced samsaric happiness. No matter how much we experience them, we are never satisfied. On the contrary, we seem to need more and more. This is the endless talk we have on the suffering of attachment. This is so brutal. It is so evident. It is so clear, but so painful to see. Because you see, this is me talking now, not Fedor. You see, the assumption of attachment, as we endlessly talk, the belief we have utterly and completely is that when you get the cake, get the job, get the boyfriend, get the nice smell, the nice taste, the nice sound, the absolute assumption is, then I will get happy, which means then I'll be satisfied. That's the unspoken, deeply instinctive belief of attachment. But it's a total, lousy, rotten lie, deep in the bones of our being. And we've been practicing it, Buddha says, for eons. So the tragedy of having practiced attachment in the past, one of the major sufferings is waking up in this life just completely programmed with dissatisfaction. And we can see with some people have it much worse than others. I mean, we can also see some people seem to be quite satisfied. I mean, I know some people who are samsaric, they're samsaric people, but they've got good hearts, they're generous. And one of them, the wife, she's incredibly, she's really always seems to be satisfied. So, okay, take away her husband and her house and her goods and things, then see, but she seems to have an ability, you know, in ordinary samsaric world, and some people are like this, to be fairly content, to be satisfied and to be grateful to others. She has no religion and she's always grateful and tries every day to think I'm very content, I'm so happy, I'm so fortunate. But some people, no matter, we can see it, no matter how much we have, we are totally, totally miserable. It is so evident. Even though they might be richer than most people, prettier than most people, have more possessions than most people, all they see is I am not enough and I don't have enough. We can see this nakedly. And then, of course, we see, you know, ourselves, we see in our own mind, we're always dissatisfied. No matter how hard we work, no matter how much we achieve, no matter how much we've got, we always feel we haven't done enough. It's like torture, you know. I haven't done enough. I haven't achieved enough. It's not good enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not, you know, we feel this. It sometimes dominates our lives. So the hard thing to see is, why is dissatisfaction a function of attachment? So that means we have to understand attachment, you know. So mainly here, the list is just the sufferings, right? But let's look again, yet again, which is the main topic in this whole entire module, really, is giving up attachment. As far as the Four Noble Truths are concerned, Lama Zopa says this in his book about how to face death without fear, that effectively the Four Noble Truths is saying that attachment is the main cause of the sufferings of samsara. Of course, the root delusion is the main one. But attachment is so utter, so primordial, so pervasive, so completely in everything. It's very hard for us to see it, you know. So the key one, if we want to understand attachment, we have to understand why it brings dissatisfaction. And I think it's fairly evident. I mean, you know, attachment's main job, Fedor later on, he discusses all the various delusions, and we'll go into that probably next week. I've already discussed a bit of this already, and I do it all the time anyway in my talks. That attachment is this concept that over-exaggerates the deliciousness of something, you know. And it comes from this dissatisfaction in the mind, this emotional hunger. The more emotional hungry you are, the more the cake looks delicious. Your mind literally projects deliciousness. You project your hunger onto it, and then you project deliciousness onto it, which makes you utterly believe that when you get it, it'll fill you up and make you satisfied. It's very strong. So why is dissatisfaction a function of attachment? It's fairly clear, because attachment exaggerates the cake's power to make you happy. Attachment makes the cake look more delicious than it is, and then attachment believes that when you get it, you'll get happy. So we know that that isn't true. It's not being depressing, it's just scientific fact. Buddha's simple logic is this: if the cake were what we thought, incredibly delicious, which has the ability to satisfy me, to make me mind, and that means to make your mind joyful. The mind that's satisfied is a joyful mind. Please hear the words. The mind that's joyful is a satisfied mind. Like we talked last week, I think. It's a happy mind, pleasant feelings, happy feelings, joyful feelings. That's another word for satisfaction. A person who's very content is satisfied, which means their mind is joyful. So we know scientifically, and this is Buddha's one simple logic to prove that attachment is a liar, that if cake were capable of what attachment thinks it is, then it is clear that the more you eat the cake, the happier you will get. I don't mean stop the cake now and eat it again tomorrow. I mean, continue in the one sitting, literally keep eating cake. And if it is genuinely, as it appears to us, the cause of happy feelings, of satisfaction, then the more you eat it, the second piece, you'll be even happier, the third piece, even happier, the fourth piece, even happier, the fifth piece, even happier. You'd end up being completely blissful. And we know with absolute certainty that it's the exact opposite. So it is obvious that not only does the cake not bring you contentment, fulfillment, satisfaction, joy, it actually brings dissatisfaction, because you become bitterly disappointed. You keep trying, waiting for the happiness to come. You eat the first piece and the second piece and the third piece, hoping each time that the happiness will come. And you know you can't eat another piece because you'd vomit. So then what are you left with? Completely disappointed, devastated. The cake let you down. You're terribly disappointed. And that increases your dissatisfaction. It's pretty obvious. It's fairly evident. So we get born with this dissatisfaction because of practicing attachment in the past. And the stronger the habit of attachment in that particular person's mind, the more nightmarish the dissatisfaction in this life. And some people live their lives only being dissatisfied, and therefore never endingly trying to find methods, things, smells, tastes, sounds, change things so that you will get satisfied. You know, we recognize all this. We just think it's normal, that's all. I think Lama's always quoted Mick Jagger, or was it Elvis or somebody? No satisfaction, you know. We can see this is the cause of the despair in life. And especially in relationships. Look at relationships, you know. The intensity of the buildup of that attachment, the expectations, the belief in this person's divineness, in the belief in this long life together, we'll be together until we're 80. The total belief of the house and the thing and the children and the thing and the building it up and the life together, all this fantasy. I'm not being sarcastic. It doesn't mean you don't have a relationship. But when you have a fantasy about it, and that's what attachment does. And when you're in love in the beginning, it is absolutely obsessive. There's no question. Attachment is obsessive, you know. You're so overwhelmed by the joy, you can't believe it. and with an absolute belief that they can only go to more happiness and more joy. The longer you're together, the more children you have, the more possessions you have, the more joy, the more joy, the more joy. Now, we know some people, like this person I'm thinking about, she's been with this same man for 40 years, 45 years. And she's a samsaric person, but she's got a lot of generosity, a lot of kindness. She's had a lot of suffering, but she really does seem to be fairly satisfied, and they're even closer as they get older to each other. That is possible. It is possible. But that's not because of attachment. That's because of virtue. That's because of goodness and kindness and love. And because the love and the kindness override the attachment. So they're very fortunate. They're very fortunate, you know. We can see if there's not that much love and patience and kindness and generosity in a relationship, therefore there's masses of attachment, it is leading to the nightmare, dissatisfaction, enraged, angry, blaming, bitter, resentful, suicide, murder. Look at the world, please. That's because there's more attachment, therefore more disappointment, therefore more anger, therefore more jealousy, therefore more despair. This is the Buddhist analysis of suffering, people. So one of the 6 sufferings is there's never any satisfaction. Of course, when you give up attachment, this is implicit, you'll be extremely satisfied because you haven't got much attachment. Then you'll be happy. Then you'll be joyful. Even if your husband does die, he does drop dead, you won't suffer so badly. This is fact from the Buddhist perspective, you know. So this third suffering, abandoning your body again and again. Again, this sounds so abstract. And of course, that's all about reincarnation. So if that's meaningful to us, think about that one. It's pretty abstract for most of us. The fourth one is taking rebirth again and again. The same logic, you know. The fifth one, moving from high to low. I think that's something we can really see in this life. This is really, really evident, you know. Look at the example in our own lives or other people's lives. Things go well, you get the job, you get the relationship, you get the partner, everything's beautiful, you've got a good reputation, and then suddenly it all goes. You get sacked, the husband leaves you, you get accused, your money all disappears, you have to start working again at the age of 75 because everything is gone. We can see this again and again and again and again in life, you know. We can see this. So he says here, the fifth suffering, and then comes the suffering of moving from high to low and low to high, moving constantly between high and low. As it says in the Vinaya, the conclusion of every accumulation is exhaustion. The conclusion of being high is to fall low. The conclusion of meeting is to part. The conclusion of life is death. So keep remembering, the only reason to think about any of these lists of sufferings is because Buddha's wanting us to see that it's revolting so that we want to give it up. And then he's giving us the method of how to get happy, of how to stop suffering and get happy. When you say it so bluntly, it sounds very shocking almost, you know. Buddha's basically telling us his methods are to how to get happy. That's it. Very simple. It's framed as giving up suffering. It's framed like that. But it's really methods to get happy. Which maybe that would excite us more. And we should reframe all Buddha's teachings, you know. The Four Noble Truths of Happiness. There is happiness. There are causes. You can achieve it. And the method. You can easily do that. It's like a shadow version of the Four Noble Truths of suffering. Get us more excited, I think. Because that's what's implied, you know. But it's good to remember that, the big picture. Otherwise, it just feels so depressing. People often say, oh, can we stop talking about suffering, please? Can we talk about the happy things? Because it's too painful for us because we don't know the reason why we should rub our nose in all this rubbish, you know. I mean, anybody who's been an alcoholic or a junkie or trying to give up bad habits or eating too much food, you know you've got to confront all this. You can't live in denial anymore. You've got to rub your nose in the misery, and then you get the enthusiasm to pick yourself up and get rid of it. Until you really know the suffering of something, you don't want to give it up because it's all to do with addiction, isn't it? So we've got to see the pain and suffering. This is a more extensive list, that's all. And the sixth one in this list of 6, being friendless. Let's have a look at this one. The final of the 6 sufferings is suffering of being friendless. You might say, oh, I'm not friendless. I have many friends. But if we really think about this, first of all, when we were born alone. Then when we die alone. And this is meaning, it doesn't mean you haven't got your 27 family all around your bed. You have, but they can't help you. That's the thing. You'll be alone. Also, so then whatever we experience, only we ourselves, this is the interesting point, this is the real point, only we ourselves can experience it. Others cannot share our pain. Our pain cannot be taken away by others. Others might show sympathy and affection, but finally we have to experience our own suffering by ourselves. So this is really very powerful. This is the logic behind why they say we are wandering through cyclic existence without any friends. That's the literal meaning. It's quite interesting because we know it's true. And that's why the suffering of being in a relationship, let's say, and there's no sympathy or affection there, you know, you feel utter, might have 27 sorry, not that. I'm not going to say that. I'll start something different. If we've got this massive attachment to being seen and heard and approved of by others, and we all do have it, it's the worst one we've all got. That's what brings loneliness. That's what brings this feeling of being utterly alone. And it's unbearable for us. So then and because it's true, we are alone. But when we have learned to accept that and know that we created the cause, it's part of the way life is, and to own our own suffering and own our own happiness and own the causes of it, then we can be content and fulfilled. Whether you have 27 friends or none, you know you are on your own in your suffering and your pain and your happiness. And therefore you don't expect others to fix it for you, which is the sadness and loneliness of attachment to reputation. It's like when we've got this intense attachment to reputation, the deepest one of all, it's like we're just like completely isolated from the entire universe. Isolated. That's why we're lonely. We don't think we have any value. We think we're completely useless. And then when we have suffering, we feel so bitter that we have no one to help us and no one to share our suffering with us. This is a really profound point, actually. So when we begin to become our own person, I like that saying, begin to understand karma and suffering and happiness and our own delusions and our virtues, and really start to become conscious as human beings, then we will be content. This is the method for getting happy. And when we realize we are alone, and it's not possible to expect someone to take our suffering from us. But it doesn't mean someone can't help us. That's what he's saying too. But in the end, you have to be the one who dies. And I think that's the terror of, let's say, think about death, you know. Because we have this powerful idea that, as Lama Zopa says, that the world consists of living people and dying people. This kind of is wandering off a little bit, you know. Living people and dying people. Then when you're with a dying person, when you really are seeing it, and you really start to think about it, the only thing of any use to that person at that time, because they are the one who's dying, they will be the one at that time who will die. So unless you fully take control of that as a dying person, you fully accept that you are dying and you own it and confront it and accept it, then you can be supported by other people. And the other person looking on, who's thinking there's the dying person, then you really know you can't take the pain away, but you can love them and support them and give them courage to own their death, you know. I'm just talking here, okay? Tara, I don't know if we have to have all these points. You're making almost like a replica of the teachings now when you write everything down. I'm not sure we have to do that.
Okay.
I mean, you've been doing it all. Suddenly you're building up more and more every time.
I know.
Describing. So I think much of what I say, I don't know, you've been doing it a few times and I don't know whether it's any help for anybody, but it began just being bullet points for me, you know.
I know, that's how it started. And then as I started to,
I know. So I don't think, I mean, it's pretty good for your own mind, but don't worry. I don't think you should do it. I think I think if you read Venerable Fedor's course notes, there's more
yeah,
than
I can bullet. I'll bullet.
a simple bullets. Yeah, simple bullets. So this is very interesting. This is a really powerful one. You do, I mean, we say it cliched in the world, or we're all alone. We say it, but we don't really think of the implication of it, I think. And when what I'm getting at, when we realize we're alone, then we will be content. Because right now, when we think we're alone, we think we're missing people to make us happy. When you know you're alone, then you'll be delighted with any help that people give you, and you won't feel lonely and sad. You'll feel joyful and content, like the yogis in the mountains who spend years there in bliss because they're working on themselves. So it's a very powerful point. And that's like the schizophrenia or having attachment. I mean it sincerely. This, the default at wrong view is I'm nothing, I'm nobody, on my own, no one loves me, no one gives me anything, and we don't know how to get happiness in ourselves, basically. When we know how to become fulfilled in ourselves by giving up attachment and delusions, then we will be joyful. And then any help we do get from others, any friends we do have, it will be a bonus, and we will thoroughly enjoy them. But you know that yourself when you've got some people who are lonely and bereft and miserable. 27 people can tell them they love them. It doesn't help because they're isolated and they're not working on their minds. You know? Yeah, the three sufferings, which were the ones I always talk about. Well, at least the first two. The suffering of suffering, and that's dealt with when we talk about, you know, all the bad things happening, the lower realms, as well as all the bad things in life, which is why we practice the first scope, which is abiding by the laws of karma, to give up those. And then we talk about the suffering of change, which is the suffering in the second scope, which is where we are now, which is caused by attachment. So we talk about this a lot. And of course, pervasive compounding suffering that's so in other words, this is page 62, contemplating the three sufferings. Suffering is finished by abiding by the laws of karma, which is first scope. Second scope, the suffering of change, you give that up when you give up attachment. The third one, pervasive compounded suffering, you give that up when you realize emptiness. So the whole path, the whole Lam Rim is framed in terms of getting rid of these three kinds of suffering. So just some different packages, you know, different packagings of sufferings. So now I think it's time for you people to ask me some questions. Any kind of question you like.
Maureen?
Yes, Venerable. So I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, but we've had a lot of us feel like, you know, if we have a obligation, a responsibility to our community, and in my case, I have a hard time understanding what my obligations are to community, and how much is that going to be an attachment to being accepted by a community or responsibility to the community, you know, because we have so much going on in the world right now, and there's so much activism and wanting to be involved and wanting to do something about the situation. I personally find myself exhausted working full time and trying to keep up with the teachings and trying to keep up with society. And at the end of the day, I just kind of burn out, and I just feel like I'm not keeping up my end. And I'm wondering what implications are with that and attachment.
Exactly, of course. Exactly, Lorraine. So just giving like a technical Buddhist answer, taking the framework of this analogy I repeat repeatedly, is that a bird needs two wings: wisdom and compassion. So at the moment in this discussion, in the discussion about karma, in the discussion about, as we're discussing here, the way all this, it's all talking about one's own self. It's like this is all one's own inner work, learning to unpack and unravel from the Buddhist perspective why we're suffering, what suffering is, what causes it, so that we can give it up, so that we can bring within ourselves joy and fulfillment. So then we can do the compassion wing, which is to help others. So basically you're describing, you know, how to help others, which is your commitment to your community, as you just put it. That's the compassion wing, Lorraine. That's totally how to help others. The Buddhist perspective is you've got to first work on yourself, work on your own neuroses, get rid of those, abide by the laws of karma, stop your own suffering, become you become this empowered, fulfilled, content person, which is the consequence of all this practice. And then you're qualified to help others. So you don't go off for 27 years and get the wisdom wing down first. You could, you do what you can in yourself every day, and that to the degree that you're giving up anger, giving up jealousy, giving up your neuroses, giving up creating negative karma, the degree that you do that, which is the accomplishment of the wisdom wing, is the degree to which you are now more qualified, step by step, to be of benefit to others, because we're all in the same boat. So if we don't do any of the wisdom wing work, Lorraine, which is how we think in our culture, you've got your typical attachments and your angers and your fears and your jealousies, and you're out there trying to work to help others. No wonder we get exhausted, Lorraine. This is why we get exhausted. Not because we've got compassion, not because even the suffering out there. We get exhausted because we have attachment, which only wants things to be lovely. And then we have aversion and depression and anger and despair when we discover that things aren't lovely. Are we communicating?
Yes, thank you.
So the degree to which we work on our own mind is the way to put it, which means the degree to which we have our own practice, we learn to understand our own attachments, our own fears, our own anger, our own jealousy and rubbish, which is the stuff that causes us suffering and drags us down and which pollutes our compassion. The degree to which we work there, which is the wisdom wing state, which is all the work we're discussing at the moment in these modules at the moment, is the degree to which we will become more content, more fulfilled, more courageous, and they're more capable of helping others. That's the general idea, Lorraine.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
It's a massive point, it's a massive point. So just keep listening, darling, keep practicing, do our best, We have to understand we've got limitations because we're not yet highly evolved spiritual beings, That's the thing, we have to know where we're at. Yes, Ariana.
Good evening, Venerable Robina. The past week I've been thinking a lot about Fred and the cake.
Good, okay.
And I just cannot understand after the third, fourth, fifth piece of that cake that is making us so sick. Why doesn't our common sense kick in and stops us from this Fred?
Because attachment's an addiction. The habit of believing in attachment, the emotional drive of attachment, the emotional hunger, but the habit, Ariella, that's the only reason. And when you look at the world, that explains why it's so hard to give up old habits, because it's like our mind is like programmed with that habit and we're totally unconscious.
But aren't we supposed to be intelligent creatures and understand?
That just proves the point that we're not.
Well,
that proves the point that we're not. We think we are so intelligent. Intellectually, we are. We're geniuses. Intellectually, conceptually, we're brilliant at creating things, but we don't have much understanding of these emotional, they're neurotic symptoms of the attachment, aversion, jealousy, all these neuroses, which Buddha is expertise, is understanding them. We just think they're normal parts of a normal person. So we don't really have answers to them in our culture. So we know you can have the best genius physicist in the universe who has got so much attachment and so much anger that they're emotionally like 5 years old. We know that because we don't have methods of dealing with these in our psychological models. We do have a little bit. This is Buddha's expertise, Ariella. Do you understand my point? It's very sobering, isn't it?
I guess that's why we're here. Well, that's why I am here.
No, same, me too, sweetheart, believe me.
Tara.
Anybody else? Hey, Tara, anybody else got questions?
Yes, I have a question I can read in the chat.
Good, okay.
Two-part. It says, so I know practicing means one needs to work on lessening the delusions, including aversion. But how does one gain renunciation without generating aversion towards samsara? And then he has a little context. It seems the more I practice, the more disgust and horror I generate towards worldly life and our collective situation. And then there's a second part, but you want me to read the second part?
Well, of course, it's part of the question.
I don't want to increase my aversion, but how is this particular aversion not necessary to stay motivated and progress on the path?
That's a really, I mean, it's a really good question, because aversion finally is a delusion. But I think the character of a delusion is quite specific. If it's a delusion, it's rooted in ego grasping, which is the sense of I, and that is rooted in absolute fear. All the delusions, if there are delusions, are expressions of neurotic, I-based, neurotic fear. So it seems that you can have, this is where I think you have to have aversion. You have to recognizing that a knife will cut you. Put it this way, recognizing that a knife will cut you, or recognizing if you drive too fast. Now, recognizing a knife is good enough, that it's very sharp. So what causes us not just to be careful with a knife. It's true, if you're intelligent and not just driven by attachment or the normal fear of delusions, you'd have an intelligent aversion to the idea of cutting yourself, because there'd be no benefit to it. It'd be silly. So you've got to see the disadvantages of something. And that doesn't mean it still is aversion. You have to have aversion to that suffering. You have to be, as Lama Zopa says, if you've got renunciation, just the thought of another moment of attachment is so repulsive. It's like being in a septic tank. It's a very vivid description, but that somehow that wouldn't be delusional, it would be intelligent. So we have to distinguish, if you've got enormous fear, then that is delusion. If there's no fear there, it's an intelligent assessment of the foolishness of, eating too much cake, believing happiness will come. The foolishness of doing all these things in samsara, recognizing steadily and clearly and intelligently, then you can call it aversion. Nothing wrong with that. But it wouldn't necessarily be the same delusion as the aversion, which is rooted in fear, which is what arises when attachment doesn't get what it wants. That's the best I can say, I think. Does that make sense to that person? If there's any comment, they can give it to me.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, there has been. Hello, darling.
Hello. I got started thinking about what we talked about last week, about happy feelings and contentment.
Yes.
Because the last weeks I got really happy feelings because I was practicing good, and I think I started to get some benefits.
Good. Wonderful.
And then I got all excited. And then I think, oh my God. And then came the downfall. Last Sunday, everything went wrong. And I always wonder, can I be attached to the Dharma? How do I know?
No, darling, it's a good question. Yes, it's a good question. So it's okay. Until we are highly advanced, Sabine, we are going to have attachment. So this is inevitable. It could be the attachment to the chocolate cake and the happy feelings that do arise after the first piece. That's a happy feeling, and it's rooted in attachment. Now, you're happy, you are having happy feelings because you are praising yourself for practicing. This is wonderful. It's called rejoicing. It's a virtue. But nevertheless, Sabine, even in that praising yourself, which is rejoicing, which is a good quality, because we've still got attachment, you can't help but get carried away with it and get a little bit arrogant. And that's why it collapses. And that's natural. So we've got to watch our minds like a hawk. So don't be afraid to rejoice. Don't be afraid to be happy with yourself, but catch your mind when you start to starts making a bigger description. Tell yourself to shut up.
Okay.
So cut it right there. But we can't help but write a description after it. Wow, I must be good. I'm doing so well. And we don't realize. So we have to learn to have this discipline with the mind. Rejoice, be happy, but don't over exaggerate it. So yes, of course it collapses, and then suddenly bad feelings come. It's a good learning, but but don't worry, it's part of the learning, darling. So be happy, be delighted.
Okay.
To the level to which the Buddha is saying we can navigate our mind and do this job is really quite subtle. So we should be so happy with what we're doing. Be so glad. And the more and more we can identify the deluded thoughts, the happy thoughts, the positive thoughts, the better we get. It's really quite subtle, Sabine. So just keep moving, darling, and be glad and learn from your mind. Learn about your mind. Learn. That's all we can do, sweetheart.
Because the low was very low. I was really shocked.
Really? Oh, really?
I said, oh my God.
Remember the thoughts. Can you, because in the end, we say up and we say down, but it's the thoughts that we're saying. So were the thoughts really against yourself and I'm hopeless and I'm no good after all? Or what were the thoughts?
I can laugh with it afterwards.
Of course you can. That's right.
But the day it happened, it was Sunday. I said, I take refuge. That's the only thing I could say. But nothing came. Nothing came.
There you go. It's okay. So just be glad you're seeing your mind up and down. It's okay. So you're doing great, darling. I rejoice.
Okay.
Good. Keep moving. That's it. Keep moving. I promise.
Thank you.
Good, sweetheart. Thank you so much. What else, darling people? Any questions?
Venerable Robina, I have a general question.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, we are practicing to get out of samsara. And if eventually we get out of samsara, we become enlightened, we stop the cycle of existence. But then in which way are we benefit all the human beings? I mean, isn't on the other end staying in cycle of existence, but practicing and helping other human beings with the compassion and with the, I mean, if I disappear from the cycle,
I understand.
You know.
I understand exactly. So this is where we have to be understanding clearly, Julio. Who's it? Julio. How do you say Julio, isn't it?
Yes, Julio.
Okay, Julio. The thing is this: if we accomplished our own nirvana, our own cessation of suffering and its causes by doing the work we're describing here, eventually recognizing suffering, giving up attachment, giving up the branch delusions, and eventually getting shamatha, and then realizing emptiness. And in one life or other, if that's the path you're on, you will finally achieve your liberation. And at the end of that life, you automatically will disappear into subtle blissful state, and you won't come back. So what you just said is absolutely clear. That would be terrible, because then you're leaving all the suffering sentient beings behind. So what if you're on the Mahayana path, you might even have achieved that level, but you don't care because you want to come back because you've got great compassion, and you keep developing this compassion, keep developing bodhicitta. And even by the lowest level on the bodhisattva path, and there are 10 stages, even by then, the lowest level bodhisattva of the 10 stages already has the ability and the power to manifest their mind in at least 100 different bodies throughout the world and the universes to help sentient beings. And each of the stages you go to the second, the third, all the way to the 10th, when you finally become a Buddha. By that point, you are capable of manifesting in countless bodies in all the realms of existence effortlessly and simultaneously. So in reality, of course you come back, but you're out of samsara now, and you become this unbelievably, insanely powerful bodhisattva and then Buddha, who never stops being born in countless bodies throughout countless universes for the sake of countless sentient beings. So that's the Buddha. That's a very different thing from achieving your nirvana. They're radically, outrageously different.
Thank you.
Are we communicating?
Thank you.
So the bodhisattvas have this insane enthusiasm. They want to be reborn again and again, but not just by doing their best, but by continuing to work on their minds and developing more power and more wisdom and more compassion, and so can manifest in countless bodies. That's the real one. And then they're just like outrageous with their levels of compassion, never stopping helping throughout the universe. There's this wonderful story of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Lama Zopa told this years ago. I always like to quote. So as we might know, if we're Tibetan Buddhists, all the Tibetans say that the Dalai Lama is the Buddha. Well, Julia, I don't know. I'm not clairvoyant, but I'm prepared to have confidence he's the Buddha. All the Tibetans would say he's the Buddha. All the lamas that I respect would say he's the Buddha. So, I have confidence. So this is the point. We think of the Dalai Lama, if he's a Buddha, well, there's this nice Tibetan gentleman living up in Dharamsala, we think of this one person. But this is the point. So if he is a Buddha, Giulio, this is nutty as this sounds, he has at this moment effortlessly is manifesting in countless bodies throughout the universe, countless, all the time, continuously, unceasingly, impossible not to. But this is a nice story. Lama Zopa, this is the time in the very early 60s when the Tibetans had come into India. And of course, all the lamas, His Holiness and the other lamas, were desperate to get land in India so they could build their monasteries, so they could all pass on the knowledge from the old lamas' minds into the young minds before Dharma died out, So they were it was a strong wish to find land. And so at this point, apparently, they were negotiating with the Indian government, who has been so kind to the Tibetans. And they had there was hundreds of thousands of acres of forest in the south of India. They were negotiating giving to the Tibetans to build their monasteries. And of course, that's what's happened. It's like little Tibet down there now. So the story goes something like this. His Holiness sent down one of the appropriate minister from the Tibetan government down to Delhi, which is about, those days you didn't fly. It was just a bus. You go down the hill, several hours driving right down the mountain to Pathankot, which is where the train station was. Then you take a 12-hour journey to Delhi, down in the plains, So, because Dalai Lama was based up in Dharamsala and the Tibetan exile government. So the Tibetan fellow got down to the Indian government building, the appropriate Indian minister in Delhi, where the government is. And he got very frustrated because he couldn't get a meeting. He was just very frustrated. So he went back up to Dharamsala and told His Holiness it was frustrating. He couldn't get a meeting. But His Holiness said, go down now. It's okay. It'll all be fine. So he took the train again down. And then that particular day, he had a meeting with the Indian fellow. And that day, the Indian minister's little boy was in the office with his daddy. And the little boy was talking to the Tibetan. And the little boy expressed the wish for a dog. So the Tibetan minister was very happy to get a dog to help something work. So he went outside and there was an Indian sadhu, a holy man on the street. And he had his little dog. Can I buy your dog? So he bought the dog and he gave the little dog to the little son, the boy. And so the little boy was so happy. He ran to his daddy in the office and daddy was happy. Everything went beautifully and the meeting happened and everything worked, So as Lama Zopa says, the sadhu and the dog were manifestations of the Dalai Lama's mind. So, of course, in our ordinary materialist world, we're happy to think that Dalai Lama is a nice fellow, but to think he's manifesting as dogs and sadhus sounds a little bit like science fiction for us. But it's all in the Tibetan, it's all in the teaching, not the Tibetan teachings. It's in the Mahayana path, the Bodhisattva teachings, all there laid out in the literature, the levels of capability of these great beings, So this is the thing. I mean, they say the Buddhas are never stopping manifesting where they are needed. That Ant could be a Buddha. Even the only way to really understand, I think, this is the Vajrayana teachings are quite helpful in describing the way we are constructed physically and the relationship of it with our mind, that the four elements, basically, our bodies are made of the four elements. And the Vajrayana, as we progress as yoginis and yogis, were able to manipulate the energy of the four elements. So basically the four elements of the world, it's a conducive environment for Buddhas to conjoin their minds with the four elements. They can manifest as a tree, a dog, a sadhu, and that sadhu didn't have to be born from a mother's womb. They can just manifest, This is the power we have, and it's all there in the literature how it can happen. But that's what Buddhas are doing continuously, never stopping, unceasingly, with their power, their compassion, and their wisdom, benefiting sentient beings. So Buddha says we can become like that. Of course, it's long-term, people. Don't hold your breath. But the logic of the possibility is all there in the teachings. That's why we have to study them. That gives us more confidence of how this is possible. This is the idea. Okay, Julia?
Thank you.
Good. I love that story.
Yes, I have another one in the chat.
And there's also just a bit more. That dog would not have, this is an important point, that dog would not have been a dog. It was the Dalai Lama's mind, the Buddha's mind, pretending to be a dog. In fact, from that perspective, The Dalai Lama is not a human either. A Buddha doesn't, when you get to the point of becoming a Buddha, when your mind is completely pervading the universe, it's completely subtle, you have omniscience, infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, infinite power, a Buddha doesn't need a body, but out of their compassion, as I've been saying, they're continually manifesting in countless bodies around the universes. But you can't tell who is a Buddha. That's why they manifest in a nice Tibetan man looking like us. But if you saw that dog, it would look like a dog, it would act like a dog, it would be could even have been a mean dog, but it would not have been a dog. It's the Dalai Lama's mind play acting as a dog. These are important things to try and understand. I mean, when we get to study the Bodhisattva teachings, we can do that. Okay, who else is there? Tara.
Yes, question. Will there ever be a point in time when all sentient beings have been liberated from samsara?
Well, don't hold your breath. But what keeps the Bodhisattvas and Buddhas full of enthusiasm to never give up is the fact that every sentient being possesses the potential to be free of suffering and its causes. If the potential were not there, and that's the logic of Buddha nature is referring to the very fact that delusions are not intrinsic in the minds of sentient beings. This is what Buddha has found. And we'll discuss more this. This is part of our discussion in this module, that the delusions, ego grasping, attachment, and all the rest are adventitious, they say. What Buddha has found is because they are misconceptions, they can be removed by wisdom. How do you think of this? Interestingly, think of this. 1 + 1 is 2. That's a conventional wisdom that we all agree with. We've proved it. We can agree on that concept. Listen to this simple point. So let's say I'm learning my math and I forget and I say 1 + 1 is 3. And Tara will say, don't be silly, Rabina. It's 1 + 1 is 2. So please listen to this point. 1 + 1 is 2 is a concept. 1 + 1 is 3 is a concept. Now, we've agreed conventionally that the correct concept is 1 + 1 is 2. So first I had the concept in my mind, 1 + 1 is 3. Incidentally, I wasn't holding on to it. I just made a mistake. And then Tara fixed me, but then I knew I didn't just believe that truth. I knew it. Because I'd said it before, but I made a mistake. But I knew it was true. I bought into that truth. So what happened when my mind was clear that 1 + 1 is 2? What happened to the thought that was in my mind the second before that's called 1 + 1 is 3? That's my question to you. What happened to that thought? Anybody got an answer? It's a very straightforward answer.
It disappeared.
Yes, Carol. Carol's got an answer. What, Carol?
Disappeared.
Good. Who else said that? Who else said it disappeared? Who said it?
Lorraine.
Who?
Lorraine.
Good, Lorraine, exactly. And that's exactly the point. It's gone like a puff of smoke. And listen to this. What made it go is my certainty of the truth. In other words, I had a realization of the truth that 1 + 1 is 2. The certainty of that realization is literally what caused the lie to be gone from my mind. That's exactly how you get enlightened. Because an enlightened, forget the enlightened, just nirvana. You've achieved liberation when you finally have removed from your mind all the lies. First, the grosser level, attachment, anger, and all the other nonsense, and eventually the ego grasping, the root delusion. And when at some point on your meditation cushion, in the depth of your samadhi meditation, you see nakedly for the first time that there never has been, isn't, and could never be the fantasy I that you've been clinging to as true since beginningless time. That moment of seeing the absence of that fantasy is the direct insight into the ultimate reality of emptiness, and you can't fall back in samsara after that. And when you've perfected that realization, you finally achieve your own liberation. And when you've achieved your own liberation, there's not one fraction of any delusions left. You got more work to do to remove what they even call the subtlest, kind of like the smell of the delusions when you've added bodhicitta. That's another discussion. But even at that level, you can't go back into samsara after that, because you've removed the lies from your mind by seeing the truth. So next point, Tara, before we finish.
No more in the chat box.
Okay, then, well, I think it's time to go on that point. So please read Venerable Fedor's delicious teachings and go and rub your nose in all the kinds of sufferings, the 3, the 6, and the 8, and know the bigger picture is that Buddha is leading us to getting free of them, because he has an option. He has an option, which is the joy and happiness of liberation. That's it, people. Thank you, sweetie pies. Thank you, Lars. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
Venerable.
much. Keep going, never give up. We just rejoice and delight all these seeds we've planted. They will not go astray. So we dedicate them by thinking all these seeds, when they ripen in the future as my Buddhahood, no matter how long it takes, it doesn't matter. When I become the Buddha as a result of this hard work, what for? What am I going to do then? I'm going to help sentient beings by manifesting in countless bodies. So I think that's why I'm doing this job. Then that's what dedicating means. And then may bodhicitta grow and grow in the hearts of all. Okay, darlings, goodbye. Thank you so much, everybody. Much love. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving.